one of the first steps I would do, especially if these words aren't quickly coming to your mind and if it's not very common nature for you to be able to use literary terms and when you're reading and thinking, is to just take a table and put it right at the top. That way, as you go, as you recognize things, you can go back and you can highlight it. And later on, when you're doing your writing, you can again blank everything and you can make sure in your plan or in your exact writing that you're including some of these things. And if you haven't ticked any of them off, then you haven't included the tools of what an author has done. It's a pretty good, safe way of making sure that you are tied to that. So let's go just through a couple things that I've annotated on Through the Tunnel by Doris Lessing. As I started off, I always look at the title. It's important. The author's trying to direct you to a main idea. And Through the Tunnel is the title she's chosen. That usually, a tunnel is a pretty commonly used symbol, definitely going down into the darkness, coming out into the light, those type of things. And so I started to wonder a little bit, especially since I already know that this is a coming-of-age story, what's going to happen when he gets through that tunnel? What, in terms of that symbol and that metaphor, what does this tunnel signify in terms of the life of this character? As we move in, one of the first thoughts that I think about is the setting and the characterization. So we start off with a young English boy who's on a crowded beach he knew well from other years, so it's a familiar beach at least. It's rocky, and on one side of the bay anyways, and that could make us think that it's in England. Later on, though, the author mentions that he meets some boys who are speaking a different language and who are from this land. So that kind of completes our feeling of the setting. So this must either be France or must be Spain, as being probably the most prevalent places for an English person to vacation year after year. Another thing that I get into is the idea of diction, and the diction strikes me right off as we see contrition sent him running after her. If you don't know what contrition is, you need to really look that up, because key words put together by an author often indicate what they're trying to look at. So contrition means giving in, supplementing, or supplicating to something. So he doesn't chooses to follow his mother not out of free will, not because he really wants to, but because he was supplicating to her. He's making her happy, and making people happy is something that starts to really characterize Jerry. We get to know his name right here, and dialogue is yet another thing that I would focus upon throughout this, because we get to see, as you go through, the difference between the dialogue, what's being said, and what's being thought. And the way that the author accomplishes this, Doris Lessing accomplishes this, is by giving us the thoughts of the characters, both of them, and that's why Doris Lessing has chosen to make this third person omniscient, and I've got an example here. She was thinking, of course he's old enough to be safe without me. And as for Jerry, he began the steep descent from the bay. We get to see all of his thoughts as he goes too. So we're stepping into both of their minds. That's third person omniscient, and the reason she's chosen to do that appears as you look at the dialogue to be so that we can see the difference between what's being said, what's being thought. And that helps to characterize them, but it also characterizes their relationship. And I kind of continue with this until I start to see a wave of imagery coming at us. We get to see a lot of color imagery. We've got the whites of her arms that happen very early on. Then we get into the colors of his mother as she's walking away. Lapping surface showed stains of purple and darker blue. And beyond that is solid heavy blue. When his mother leaves, we have a speck of yellow under an umbrella that looked like a slice of orange peel. And remembering, since I started with this tunnel in mind, I start to see imagery that adds up to sunlight moving down into darkness. If you just looked across the color spectrum, you would see the exact same process. Again, we come back to some diction of nervous supplication when Jerry meets the boys. Again, he's trying to please somebody. We see that diction is really key to showing his character. He's constantly trying to please somebody, which is kind of typical for someone who's coming of age. Then as we start to get closer towards the danger of getting through that tunnel, you start to see heavy blue dark shapes and the water's starting to turn to a black wall of looming and things of that nature, and you start to see him descending into the tunnel with imagery. And I've made all of my imagery blue so I can start to see all of the imagery kind of adding up. I made all of my dialogue yellow so I could see all of my, when I wanted to look at something very quickly, I could see all of the yellow. And as you can see, moving through, the only last things I really annotate, because I've kind of seen the patterns of the story and I can come back and find the evidence later. And realize this is my second reading of the story. The first one was just to understand it. So I start to then see the climax of the story. And after the climax, it's interesting because this is where Doris Lessing truly shows us the theme, which is something I hadn't mentioned of the story. And I'll go back and tick that in my box now. The theme of the story is about his reaction to this moment. Yes, we've got a kind of a heroic moment where a young boy overcomes something that's very difficult, and he goes through the tunnel. And at that moment, when he conquers this challenge, almost dying in the process, I mean, hurting himself so badly that he's having these nosebleeds, we get to the falling action and the resolution, or the denouement. And when we have this, he now wants nothing to do with the boys. He doesn't want to show them that he can do this, which might be a typical reaction. He doesn't have to go prove himself to them anymore. And he returns to this dialogue of saying, "Mommy, I can stay underwater for 2 minutes, 3 minutes at least." He doesn't say, "I went through this tunnel." He doesn't need to brag to her about that. And he uses the word mummy back to the diction. And mummy is definitely a childish way of referring to your mother, not mother or mum or something like that. And we have this final thought of mother looking at him closely, noticing how awful he looks after he's almost died underwater in this cave. And she said, "Oh, don't fuss. Nothing can happen. He can swim like a fish." And we see how she also wants to breed his independence and not to get in his way, so much that it overcomes her need as a mother to make sure that he's safe. So themes start to really emerge in the reactions that we have here, and that's what I would put into my writing as I start to organize my outline.